Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Georgina Paul, and I'm the acting principal of St Hilda's College. And on behalf of the college, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the inaugural Dr. Joyce Mitchell Cook Memorial Lecture. And I'd like to extend an especial welcome to Professor Anita Allen, tonight's speaker. Professor Allen, it's an absolute privilege and an honor to welcome you to this St Hilda's College event. I'm going to say a few words to begin with about the genesis of the lecture series that we're inaugurating this evening. Joyce Mitchell Cook was an undergraduate at St Hilda's College from 1955 to 1957, studying for the Joint School of Philosophy, Psychology and Physiology, also known as PPP. At that time, it was not unusual for gifted Americans to come to Oxford to do a second BA in 2 years. After her time at St Hilda's, Joyce went on to receive a PhD in philosophy at Yale in the United States. For a woman at that time, all of this was an achievement in itself. But for a Black American woman at that time, Joyce's achievement is quite particularly noteworthy. Joyce was, as you are about to learn, a remarkable woman in so many ways. And she must have been a wonderful friend, for it is due to the generosity of one of her friends while she was here studying at St Hilda's that we are able not only to institute this lecture series into the St Hilda's calendar, but also to establish a scholarship for BA/ME graduates to come to study at St Hilda's. That friend is Eleanor Schaffer. Eleanor and Joyce shared a flat in Joyce's first year at St Hilda's. Eleanor has captured this time, along with other reminiscences about Joyce, on a wonderful video which we've posted on the college website. And if you haven't already viewed this video, I urge you to watch it after tonight's event. Eleanor herself went on to become a professor of comparative literature and a fellow of the British Academy. Professor Schaffer has been a driving force behind the establishment of this lecture series. She is also determined to ensure that all young people, regardless of race, have the opportunity to study the subject that meant so much to Joyce, philosophy. In just a moment, I will hand over to Dr. Anita Avramides, Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy here at St Hilda's, to chair tonight's event and formally to introduce Professor Allen to you. But before I do this, I would like to end my contribution to tonight's event by reading out some words of support that we've received from Professor Chris Timpson, Chair of the Faculty of Philosophy here in Oxford. Professor Timpson writes, "On behalf of the Faculty of Philosophy at Oxford, I am delighted to express our celebration and support on the occasion of this inaugural Dr. Joyce Mitchell Cook lecture. And further, I am delighted to add our warm welcome to Professor Allen. We look forward to this lecture being an annual recognition of the legacy of Joyce Mitchell Cook and an annual expression of the ambition of philosophy to welcome with wide arms all in intellectual inquiry. We add our thanks to everyone who has worked so thoughtfully and valuably to establish this lecture series." I now hand you over to Dr. Anita Avramides to do the introductions.
Thank you, Principal. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I have a few preliminaries, a few words about Joyce Mitchell Cook, and to tell you how the evening will proceed. I want to begin with a quotation from an interview with Joyce Mitchell Cook, conducted and published by Professor George Yancey, a friend and colleague of Joyce's. "I tell my students that the only reason to go on in philosophy is because your life is unthinkable without it, because you have to pursue questions that are traditionally regarded as philosophical questions. That's the only reason to go on into it." When I read these words and so many others that Joyce wrote about her experience as a philosopher, I dearly wish I could have met her, talked with her about our experiences, because I think there's so much we have in common. And this idea of having things in common is something I think it's important not to lose sight of. Of course, there's one important thing we don't have in common, and that's her experience as a Black woman in philosophy. And this experience is something that Joyce herself tried to understand as her career progressed. And it's her perspective as a Black American woman in philosophy that we all need to understand. But what's also important to remember, above race, above gender, and above anything else that one can think of that might introduce difference between us, is what brings us together. And tonight, one of those things that brings us together is philosophy. Joyce had a passion for philosophy, and this is one of the many things about her that we aim to celebrate tonight. That Joyce was a philosopher against the odds, one might say, makes me even more interested in her and in her story. And that story is one we're going to hear about this evening. Around 2 years ago, the development director here at St Hilda's approached me to explain about a special gift that might be coming our way. And she said that the intention of the donor was to honor the first Black American woman to receive a PhD in philosophy in America and who studied at St Hilda's in the mid-1950s. My first reaction was to wonder how on earth she came to be at St Hilda's. I've since come to learn that it's very likely that she came to be here because of the pioneering work that another much earlier generation of forward-thinking women on both sides of the Atlantic had done to ensure that women had access to the very best educational opportunities. Joyce was a student at the women's-only Bryn Mawr College in the United States. And as I understand it, Dame Helen Gardner, one of St Hilda's most distinguished fellows at that time, had encouraged an educational link between St Hilda's and several North American colleges, Bryn Mawr included. As a result, young women had the opportunity to come to the US, from the US to Oxford to study. While at Oxford, Joyce studied with Brian Farrell, the first wild reader in mental philosophy, and with Mary Warnock. I understand it was Mary Warnock who recommended that Sir Peter Strawson take Joyce on as a student, which he did. It doesn't surprise me that Bryn Mawr and St Hilda's welcomed Joyce with open arms. In their commitment and dedication to the education of young women, these colleges were interested in spotting talent and in giving opportunity to those who had been denied an education in traditionally all-male institutions. When St Hilda's opened its doors to men in 2008, we pledged that we would never forget our foundation, that we would always keep our doors open to talent wherever it is to be found. All that we ask is those who come to St Hilda's that they remember our commitment to helping those who can find themselves excluded for whatever reason from the education we have to offer. At the moment, we find that Black and ethnic minority, that is what we call BAME students, feel excluded, or at least aren't represented amongst us in the numbers we would all like. And it is in an effort to encourage such students to come to Oxford that we hope that Eleanor Schaffer's wonderful donation in Joyce Mitchell Cook's name will serve as a beacon. I'm now going to explain how the evening is going to proceed. After the lecture, there'll be around a half an hour when Professor Allen has kindly said she will answer questions from the audience. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat function as the lecture is progressing. I'll put your question, or those we have time for, to our speaker. Now, in order to introduce the perspective of a more current generation of philosophy students, I've invited a panel of 3 students at different points in their career to join us for this Q&A. They're going to come on the screen now and introduce themselves quickly, after which time they're going to disappear again and reappear at the end of the talk. So may I now introduce or ask the students to introduce themselves? Do I see Lawrence?
Yes, you do. Hello, everybody. My name is Lawrence Okoth Odida. I studied physics and philosophy at St Hilda's back in 2012. but then changed over to study computer science and philosophy instead, which is kind of a first at St Hilda's. And to my recollection, I don't think it has been studied there since. There was a relationship brokered between Hertford College and St Hilda's, owed especially to Anita for all the work that she did to help that arrangement occur. I graduated in 2017 with a master's comp phil. And since then, I've been working as a software engineer in the financial technology or fintech space.
Thank you, Lawrence. We'll see you again later. Ombline.
Hello all, I'm Ombline Dami. As you may have noticed from my name, it's a bit foreign sounding. I'm originally from France. I did a Bachelor's of Arts in Philosophy and German at St Hilda's College, and I'm now doing a Master of Studies at Hertford College in Comparative Literature, focusing especially on the narrative representations of trauma in French and German 21st century literature.
Thank you so much, Ombline. And Buki.
Thank you, Dr. Avramides. My name is Buki Fatona. I have degrees in microbiology, theology, a master's in epistemology, philosophy of mind, and religion. I'm currently undertaking research, doctoral research in the intersect of cognitive neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and religion at Wolfson College here at Oxford.
Thank you so much. I very much look forward to hearing your contributions later this evening. You're now going to magically disappear. And I'm going to turn to the final introduction and the big introduction of the evening. Professor Allen is a most fitting person to give our inaugural lecture in this series. She is the Henry R. Silverman Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She's the first African-American woman to have received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan and a degree in law from Harvard Law School. She also has the distinction, one of so many, of being the first African-American woman to be president of the American Philosophical Association. She is an expert on privacy law and has published over 100 scholarly articles. To date, she has published 5 books. I'm going to mention 2. Her first, Uneasy Access, Privacy for Women in a Free Society, and her latest, Privacy Law and Society. We are delighted to welcome Professor Allen to give our very first Joyce Mitchell Cook Memorial Lecture. Professor Allen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Avramides, and I'm so happy to be here. Principal Paul, colleagues, and friends, I'm extremely pleased to have been asked to deliver the inaugural Joyce Mitchell Cook Memorial Lecture at St Hilda's College, Oxford. In the United States, as well as in the UK, we celebrate Dr. Cook as the first Black woman to receive a PhD in the field of philosophy. As I will explain this evening, Dr. Cook should be remembered not only as a trailblazer for women in philosophy, but also as an engaged public philosopher, a bioethicist, and an analytic philosopher of race. Joyce Cook was awarded her PhD in philosophy in 1965 by Yale University. Yale was and remains one of the most prestigious universities in America. And at the time, only a very, very few women earned a PhD in philosophy. In fact, there were very few women at Yale altogether. That a preacher's daughter from a drab steel town of Sharon, Pennsylvania, one of a dozen children, was among the first women and the first Black woman is truly remarkable. Prior to receiving her historic PhD, Dr. Cook had already received a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College, as was mentioned. This is an academically rigorous private women's college in an affluent suburb of Philadelphia. Cook was one of only a handful of Black students attending the elite Bryn Mawr in the 1950s. For 20th century Americans, Cambridge and Oxford universities symbolized the ultimate in training in analytically rigorous philosophy. And for that reason, Cook traveled to the United Kingdom after graduating from Bryn Mawr. St Hilda's awarded Cook a second bachelor's degree, and I believe also a master's degree in PPE. Cook would later highly praise her attentive mentors at Oxford. She would credit them for teaching her how to write and edit exceptionally well. Indeed, when Cook left Oxford and went to Yale, she was a standout as a writer. Though only a student, a female, and Black, she was invited to teach and was appointed managing editor of a leading philosophical journal, the Review of Metaphysics. She wrote numerous short book reviews for the journal in 1959 and 1960. And separately, she worked for the prestigious Yale University Press. Now, on some level, Cook had to know that her accomplishments were outstanding and unusual for a Black woman. But she recounted that she was not aware of being the very first Black woman in philosophy PhD until the late 1960s, when a colleague on the faculty of Howard University, which is the historically Black university in Washington, D.C., where she taught for a while, made the observation. So someone told her, Black woman, and she thought, I guess that's true. So how did Cook come to be recognized? When I made the decision in 1974 to pursue a career in philosophy, I knew nothing of Cook and the other two Black women who had come before me, with one exception. I knew of the towering American radical icon of the 1970s, Angela Davis. Angela Davis was the second Black woman after Cook to receive a PhD in philosophy. Her degree was from Humboldt University in Berlin. Angela Davis spent her childhood in the southern state of Alabama. Her parents were leftists who sent their very, very politically engaged daughter to New York to be educated. Davis became a communist and later joined forces with the radical Black Power movement. Her radicalism cost her a job at the University of California, Los Angeles. But she really gained international notoriety as she became a fugitive from justice, wrongly implicated in a courtroom assassination carried out with guns that she had purchased. Eventually acquitted of any wrongdoing, Davis flourished in an academic career, teaching and advocating for prison abolition, gender equality, and racial justice. Joyce Mitchell Cook and Angela Davis were near polar opposites. Joyce was mainstream, a moderate who promoted change through a rational deliberation within existing political systems. Her philosophical role models were the Oxford crowd. Davis, by contrast, was an outspoken radical who looked and sounded the part. She was prepared to see existing structures replaced from the bottom up. Davis's philosophical role models were continental Marxists and the Frankfurt School. Cook's distinctive ideas and ideals about philosophy are revealed in a radio interview on The Black Philosopher that she gave in 1970 with William Jones, who was a religion scholar from Yale, and Robert Williams, a philosopher from Vanderbilt University. She was at the time a professor at Howard, and they gathered at Wingspread Conference Center in Racine, Wisconsin. In response to questions about why there are so few Blacks in philosophy, Dr. Cook remarked that an interest in truth, capital T truth, made me go into philosophy. And she said, we've already heard this quotation, but from a different source, there's only one reason to choose philosophy. It's not to make money or to achieve status. It's very important to do those things for some people, but she said that the only reason to do philosophy is because your life is unthinkable without it. Your life is unthinkable without it. Dr. Cooks were not widely known until 1998 when George Yancey, now a professor of philosophy at Emory University, published an interview with her in his book, African American Philosophers, 17 Conversations. An enlightening interview with Cook at the time really brought her remarkable story to life. Her story in her own voice was part of this amazing book project that George Yancey completed. And then about 10 years after, almost 10 years after the Yancey interview, Dr. Catherine Sophia Bell, formerly Dr. Catherine Gines, organized a support group for Black women philosophers called the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers. And at our first meeting, held at Vanderbilt University, Bell introduced Cook to an adoring community of about 20 Black women philosophers and student philosophers as the Black woman philosopher, the first Black woman philosophy PhD. Now, a journalistic historian of philosophy, Colin Romano, came to that Vanderbilt event, and he wrote about Dr. Cook and the meeting of the Collegium for the popular press. And then later, Romano included a little bit about Cook in a book he wrote called American the Philosophical, in a chapter on women philosophers of note. And today, Cook's recognition grows. The American Philosophical Association has created an award named in Cook's honor. And a few years ago, Yale University organized the first conference that was honoring Dr. Cook. At that big conference, George Yancey gave the keynote, and I was honored to be among the principal speakers. Before diving into Cook's philosophical contributions, allow me to share a word with you about my first personal encounter with Dr. Cook. I had the pleasure of meeting her almost 10 years before Yancey met and wrote about her. I was introduced to Cook by the now Berlin-based philosopher Adrian Piper in the late 1980s. Among the first 5 African-American women to receive their PhDs in philosophy, Adrian and I were both teaching at Georgetown University and living in Washington. Adrian was teaching in the philosophy department, and I was teaching in the law school with a secondary appointment in philosophy. Joyce was living in Washington, D.C. too, as an independent scholar. So Adrian discovered her and made an appointment for us to go and visit Joyce in her home. It was a thrilling day. I remember vividly picking up Adrian in a bright little yellow Toyota that I borrowed from my husband and zipping through Washington, D.C. to Joyce's apartment. And upon our excited arrival, I thought Joyce was so gracious and that she seemed very glad to have visitors to her small, modest home. By her story, the Yale PhD, the time working in the White House, and the inexplicable failure of Harvard University to grant her tenure. I confess that Joyce struck me at the time as somewhat eccentric because she didn't appear to have a job as an academic, but she said she spent her days at the Library of Congress reading and studying philosophy. Moreover, she didn't discuss anything the least bit personal. Nothing about her means of support, nothing about her family, nothing about her health, nothing about her very interesting ex-husband, Dr. Cook. No chit chat. I would say she was probably the warmest all business person I'd ever met and that you could ever possibly imagine. After our energizing visit with Dr. Cook, Adrian Piper approached me about the idea of starting an organization of Black women philosophers, the Association of African American Women Philosophers, we thought it would be called. This would be a support and discussion group. It was a radical idea at the time. Adrian felt it was important that our group be kept secret, though, lest our members face retaliation for calling attention to our experiences of racial discrimination and disparagement. We had indeed begun to share our horror stories. There were many of them. A number of women had lost their jobs. Cook was not tenured by Howard. That was one scandal. Adrian Piper was denied tenure by the University of Michigan before she was tenured by Georgetown University, another scandal. Angela Davis had been fired twice by the University of California, and Laverne Shelton, who's now an independent poet, had been denied tenure by Rutgers University. Indeed, the first 4 Black women to be eligible for a tenured position in US philosophy were denied tenure. All had that experience of being passed over for tenure, despite being brilliant and having PhDs from top schools, Harvard, Humboldt, University of Wisconsin, and Yale. Something wasn't working right for Black women in philosophy, even through the 1970s. Piper and I tried to identify and reach all of the Black women with PhDs in philosophy. Our initial list included, of course, Joyce Mitchell Cook and Angela Davis, but also myself and Adrian, Laverne Shelton, Georgette Sinkler, a classicist, and Michelle Moody Adams, a now quite prominent ethicist. We tried to arrange meetings of the Black women philosophers in Washington, D.C. in connection with meetings of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. But we couldn't quite ever get more than 4 of us together at a time, and the project was abandoned. There simply wasn't a critical mass. Well, I am so glad that things have changed. There is now a critical mass, and I'm so glad that Black women philosophers now number in the dozens. We can and do successfully meet, and we have celebrated the mother of us all, Dr. Joyce E. Mitchell Cook. I now want to talk about the legacy and philosophical work of Dr. Cook. It's not just that she was the first Black woman that makes her important. What she wrote and what she said and what she didn't write and what she didn't say are incredibly instructive for all of us. By the standards of today, Joyce Mitchell Cook was not a highly productive scholar. She only published 2 scholarly articles. She didn't write a book. Why didn't Cook write more philosophy? She was certainly smart and educated enough. Well, based on what Cook said about herself in her interviews with George Yancey and what she said to me over the years, she seems to have believed that you have to read and analyze everything relating to a topic before you can start to write about it. And when you do write, you have to be logical and unbiased. Now, this read everything first mentality worked against Cook, in my opinion. Indeed, in her 1998 interview with George Yancey, she spoke of being immersed, if not mired, in mounds of note cards. She wanted to write a book on what decades later she still referred to in the parlance of the 1960s as the Black experience. But her research and understanding were never sufficient to allow her to complete the project. She also wanted to write an autobiography, but that project too was stymied by her perfectionism, her self-imposed high standards of readiness and perfect timing. So Cook's legacy is not about the volume of her finished academic writings. Her legacy instead consists in 4 main contributions. And I hope actually that the most enduring contribution of this lecture is in communicating to the world a clear statement as to why George Mitchell Cook's philosophical work is important and in what categories that work can be identified to belong to. So here goes the 4 categories. Right. So first, she should be remembered, and her legacy resides in her being an academic trailblazer in philosophy, as I just elaborated, a life of accomplishment, both the perils and the opportunities of being the first. But in addition to being a trailblazer, Cook's legacy consists in 3 other important contributions. 1, she was an engaged public philosopher, a publicly engaged public philosopher, and she demonstrated by her life's work that a training in philosophy can be useful for high-level employment outside of the academy. Next, she was among the first bioethicists concerned about informed consent and human subject research. And finally, she was among the first analytical philosophers of race, demonstrating the value of applying the tools of analytic philosophy that she learned at Oxford to the topic of race and the diverse experiences of African Americans and Blacks of other African descent. I want to comment on each of these important legacies in turn, starting with the trailblazer legacy. In terms of her astonishing academic degrees, Cook was a trailblazer, as I've already said. But one of the difficulties of trailblazers is knowing what topics are worth writing about and finding appropriate mentors. In her interview with George Yancey, Cook described her PhD thesis as misguided. She described her own PhD thesis as misguided. By the way, I would describe mine that way too. But one has to agree with her that it was not a project calculated to put her in a good place for practical success. Cook wrote her PhD thesis on the value theory of someone you've probably never heard of, Stephen C. Pepper. Her thesis was called A Critical Examination of Stephen C. Pepper's Theory of Value. A professor at the University of California, in 1942, Pepper published another book called World Hypotheses. And in 1958, Pepper published a massive 732-page tome, The Sources of Value. In this obscure book, Pepper elaborates an idiosyncratic taxonomy of all the things human beings value and why. Pepper sought to defend perspectives influenced by the pragmatist John Dewey. In 1960, Pepper published a book called Ethics, and Cook, whose ethical philosophy was more Kantian deontological in flavor, had to master all of Pepper's major writings in order to complete her dissertation: World Hypotheses, Sources of Value, and Ethics. So Cook's dissertation on Pepper is extremely well written and intelligent, clear and analytical. It proved that she can do philosophy exceedingly well at the highest levels of expertise. But it was not a dissertation calculated to demonstrate her capacity for bold originality or to put her in conversation with people in the academy who would be ongoing sources of collegiality and mentorship. Pepper simply wasn't important enough or widely read enough to warrant her devotion. By the time the thesis was finished, Cook had run through several supervisors and had left Yale to work at the US State Department. Cook's doctoral work helped to launch a career in government service, but it did not provide a natural bridge for her to engage fellow Black American intellectuals. It's striking, though, that writing a dissertation in the midst of the civil rights movement, this was the 1960s and 1970s, in that context, Cook never once alludes to the American struggle for racial equality explicitly as an example of conflicts or failures of value. And there's nothing in her dissertation which would signal that she's a woman or a Black woman. That was my first conclusion, but upon closer inspection, maybe there is a sense in which Cook's identity comes through in her extremely dispassionate analytical analysis of Stephen Pepper. So there's a place in her dissertation where Cook comes to life in response to a hypothetical ethical dilemma posed by Pepper in his book, Ethics. The hypothetical goes like this. A professor and his wife, a housewife, take in a college student for whom they provide room and board in exchange for household help. The student becomes ill with a fever. The wife would like to call a doctor and send the girl to stay at the campus infirmary until she's all better, so she won't infect the family or become even sicker. But the girl is a member of a religious community that is opposed to formal medicine. So for religious reasons, she doesn't want to go to the doctor. Pepper, Stephen Pepper, the philosopher, believes that the ethical thing for the housewife to do is to reduce the conflict. And one can do this by letting the girl stay in place in light of her religion and to make sure that future students who live with them agree in advance to medical care in the event that they get ill. Now, Cook found completely inadequate Pepper's religious freedom plus contract emphatic analysis of the hypothetical. Ethics is not, she insists, just about reducing conflict between persons. Good ethics would not require self-sacrifice on the part of the parents, placing themselves and their children at risk of what could be meningitis or some other highly contagious and dangerous disease. Moreover, giving in to the girl would not end the wife's inner moral conflict, and her conflict matters too. Pepper's advice would place a professor and his wife at risk of legal liability for not, in loco parentis, seeing to it that the girl, who is a minor, gets care and that her parents are informed of her predicament. So whereas Pepper tried to compartmentalize the ethical issue as a housewife's private ethical problem, requiring her to back down and sacrifice, Cook's response understands that a woman with caretaking responsibilities is a full-blooded moral agent in her own right and lives a life of interconnection implicating broad social expectations and legal norms alike. Cook's response strikes me as influenced by her being a worldly woman who understands the ethical dimensions of subordinated social roles and status, such as that of a 1950s, 60s housewife. Among her legacies, Joyce Cook was an engaged public philosopher. In fact, someone with her career path today would be described as a public philosopher engaged in public philosophy. In the US context, the term public philosophy is applied to practical activities performed by professionally trained philosophers that directly engage public affairs, facilitated explicitly or implicitly by philosophical methods, concepts, and theories. Public philosophy often takes philosophers outside of the walls of the academy to work alongside policymakers, activists, and others seeking to advance practical goals. Extramural public philosophy in this sense is exemplified by my friend Paul Root Wolpe, who was appointed senior bioethicist at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in the US. It's also exemplified by a philosopher called William Galston, who before landing at the Brookings Institution served as deputy assistant to President Clinton for domestic policy, as well as executive director of a national commission on civic renewal. That's a mouthful, National Commission on Civic Renewal. But before the likes of Wolpe or Galston was Joyce Mitchell Cook. Cook had an academic career. She taught at a women's college, Wellesley, from 1961 to 1962. She also taught at Connecticut College for a couple of years, 1968 to 1970, and of course at Howard University from 1966 to 1977, interrupted by her 2 years at Connecticut College. But extraordinary for a philosopher, a PhD philosopher, Cook worked for the United States State Department for a year and a half as an analyst of events in several African countries. And then she worked for the former Office of Economic Opportunity. She would eventually work in the White House as a speechwriter and communications analyst for President Jimmy Carter. That was between 1977 and 1981 after her unsuccessful time at Howard University. Cook's intellectual rigor and her excellent communication skills helped her to succeed in roles outside of the academy. That's quite a legacy. The bioethicist. Joyce Mitchell Cook was interested in metaethics and normative ethics, exemplified by her PhD thesis. But she was also interested in practical applied ethics and professional ethics. In one of Cook's precious few published papers, she takes on what would now be considered a topic in the field of bioethics. And that was an important field, as you know, born in the 1970s. So her paper entitled The Problem of Informed Consent Focusing on Prisons, that was included in a 1976 report, was among the first major papers written about the topic of informed consent in the context of biomedical research. And that was, I think, an amazing accomplishment. I myself was a member of Barack Obama's Bioethics Commission, and so it's particularly significant to me that Cook was a bioethicist long before I ever dared to work in that area. So she was a trailblazer in that area as well. This paper she wrote was published by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, currently called the Department of Health and Human Services. Well, the overall report focused on experimentation on human subjects who are confined to prisons. This actually is an interesting link between Angela Davis and Joyce Mitchell Cook. They were polar opposites, as I said. They both spent some of their intellectual energy on analyzing the perils and predicaments of men and women who are confined to prison. Cook's paper dealt with prisoners and other vulnerable populations, such as children and people with mental disabilities. So some Americans in the field of experimentation on human subject believe that it was appropriate to experiment on what would be now offensively called retarded children. They thought it was appropriate to experiment on kids who were not able to live at home, who were institutionalized by virtue of their mental disabilities. One such expert defended the idea of deliberately infecting children entering institutions with hepatitis on the grounds that they're likely to get hepatitis anyway. Cook saw this kind of thinking as dangerous and reminiscent of Nazi thinking. She wrote in her paper, I shall deliberately dose you with hepatitis because you're going to get it anyway, seems to me to have eluded down the slippery slope of the German doctors at Nuremberg who attempted to defend their experiments on the grounds that their subject victims were going to die anyway. She asked, Cook asked, shall we allow this kind of rationale to range over the terminally ill? They're going to die anyway. So why not experiment on them, she asked. And then she asked, shall we extend this idea to the public at large because everybody's going to die anyway? So a very provocative way to challenge this idea that you're going to die anyway provides a rationale for turning a person into a guinea pig. In connection with the wariness engendered at Auschwitz, she raised the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiments. African-American men were deceptively enrolled by the United States Health Service, Public Health Service, in research aimed at following the course of untreated syphilis, based, by the way, on the false belief that Blacks have a particularly unique virulent form of syphilis and that the Black community is especially prone to syphilis. As for persons confined in prison following conviction for crimes, some American experts in the field at the time, in Cook's time, believed that the prison population was perfect for experimentation on human subjects. Because, they said, they were confined, easily controlled, easily accessed, and they also believed that maybe it was morally admirable for people who had been convicted of crimes to repay their debt to society by handing over their body for research. Well, Joyce Mitchell Cook violently disagreed, probing deeply into the issue of ethical motives and incentives to discover what it means to be able to give truly informed consent. And she doubted that incarcerated persons can exercise the true moral agency required by authentic informed consent to place their bodies and their health on the line. Analytic philosopher of race. So Cook was not what we would call today a critical race theorist, one intent upon exposing the dynamics of power and wealth and racism. She was instead what I think we'd call today an analytic philosopher of race. And she may even have been the first analytic philosopher of race. She can be compared favorably to my Pennsylvania colleague, University of Pennsylvania colleague, Quayshawn Spencer, who also is interested in issues of race and biology. Quayshawn also uses methods of logic, analytical methods of logic and reasoning in his reasoning to find inconsistencies in race discourse and to make positive recommendations about how we should think about race and why. In all of her writings, Dr. Cook displayed analytical rigor learned at Oxford. In the Wingspread interview, she identified logical consistency and clarity as the central philosophical values to be pursued in a Jamesian, quote, persistent, self-critical, and stubborn, unquote, intellect. She always began her philosophical work stressing the importance of defining key terms for the sake of conceptual clarity. She often sought to disambiguate terms and concepts and arguments. She wrote with self-confidence and occasionally with aggression. I'm tempted to say she wrote like a white male. She was extremely self-confident and aggressive in her writing style. In 1977, Cook published an analytical style paper in a special edition of Philosophical Forum devoted to the African-American experience. Cook's paper, called On the Nature and Nurture of Intelligence, dealt with controversies over IQ testing and its implications. In this work, Cook drew on her training in psychology, the degree that she earned at Oxford. I note that Cook was unimpressed by the obnoxious argument of Nobel Prize-winning scientist William Shockley, who achieved fame in the 1970s for declaring that Black people are genetically inferior to white people and thus unlikely to benefit from the interventions designed to improve our socioeconomic environments. Shockley stated that, quote, "My research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is heredity and racially genetic in origin, and thus not remedial by a major degree of practical improvements in the environment." Cook was similarly unimpressed by the conclusions later of The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, a book by psychologist Richard Herrnstein and political scientist Charles Murray, published to great fanfare in 1994. Herrnstein and Murray argued in the 1990s that human intelligence is substantially influenced by both heredity and environmental factors. They defended evidence of IQ testing in which Asians outperform whites and whites outperform Blacks. And they argued that it seems highly likely to them that both genes and environment have something to do with racial differences. The idea that genes have something to do with racial differences in intelligence is what Cook took on, and what I think we still have to take on today is a very important and interesting question, one which is very, very inflammatory and likely to be gotten wrong. I believe Cook would be, by the way, pleased that the use of standardized testing, such as the SAT and the ACT for admission to American universities and colleges has come under fire. And many of our top universities have dropped these tests altogether. The bias implicit in standardized testing can no longer be ignored. Historically, there's been a gap between the test scores of Black students and white students, and it's been shown that the tests do not predict success in college, which depends upon drive and resilience and hard work. I think if Cook were alive today, she would support the idea of eliminating these so-called standardized and objective tests as a criterion for university and college admission. But back to the Philosophical Forum. In that paper, Cook examined the conflicting claims of various experts on race and heredity, arguing that, and I might say arguing with her typical restraint and dispassion. She argued there was insufficient evidence, empirical evidence, to support claims of Black inferiority. No anger, no frustration, simply stating the facts in a logical, analytical way. There's not sufficient evidence to support claims of Black inferiority. Cook was not persuaded at all that intelligence is significantly a function of heredity and that Blacks, regardless of wealth, outperform whites no matter how poor. on IQ tests, probably due to, some of these experts said, due to innate differences between Blacks and whites. Now, Cook had been the valedictorian, the #1 student in her class of nearly all white students in Sharon, Pennsylvania. And she also earned degrees from the world's finest universities, Oxford and Yale. So she would naturally find claims of Black IQ inferiority suspicious, inherently suspicious. She ended her philosophical forum paper with a sharp and poignant observation that the IQ enthusiasts who are intent upon proving Black inferiority have not bothered, oddly, to chronicle the genius of Black men and women. Everybody knows that the British philosopher John Stuart Mill was a genius with a likely IQ of 190, Cook explained. But she asked, who has bothered about the intelligence of countless Black geniuses who achieved greatness despite hunger, despite cultural malnutrition and an unfriendly land? What about George Washington Carver? What about Booker T. Washington? What about Mary McLeod Bethune? Rest in peace, she concluded. Rest in peace. We celebrate Joyce Mitchell Cook to celebrate the idea that the love of philosophy knows no boundaries of race, class, or gender. There's no demographic limitation on who can fall in love with philosophy and who can excel in the discipline. Dr. Cook once said that she felt she'd been born too soon. And to be sure, her ability to flourish as a professionally employed philosopher would have been much greater if she'd gotten her PhD just 15 years later in 1980 when Adrian Piper and I did. The opportunity for like-minded collegial exchange, for publication, for recognition for women of color continues to grow. I so wish that Dr. Cook could have lived long enough to see me, a Black woman, elected as the first Black woman of the American Philosophical Association. To finally see a Black woman's name on a list of distinguished philosophers that begins with John Dewey would have meant a lot to her. I know it. She would have been very proud. So in a sense, Dr. Cook was born too soon. And yet I like to think that she was born at exactly the right time. She was born just in time to quietly exploit the gains of post-World War II civil rights movement and the women's rights movement to break down barriers of race and gender in philosophy. She is someone who was like the climber who fixes the ropes. Someone extraordinary always needs to fix the rope so others can scale the highest mountains behind them. And that is what Joyce Mitchell Cook did for me and people like me. And she did it with brilliance and with grace. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anita. That was absolutely wonderful. I learned so much, and you know, she may not have published much, but what she did say was very interesting, very important. And I thank you for bringing that out tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're now going to, our students have reappeared. The audience has already started to ask a few questions, but I am going to start with some student questions. Lawrence, I think you had a question that you wrote in the chat while Professor Allen was speaking. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, and thank you so much, Professor Allen, for this wonderful lecture, and hope it stirs a lot of conversation going. So I guess the question I've had kind of picks out one of the things you mentioned in there. So the problem I've noticed for students getting into philosophy is kind of knowing what the right way to do philosophy is. So knowing the types of questions to ask, the tone in which you're meant to ask them, and the force with which you'd attack or defend a position. And often those demeanors are adopted from your environment. So your tutors, your mentors and peers. And you said specifically that, you know, there was this aggression of a white male philosopher in Joyce's writings. So
style, yes.
Yes, that kind of style. So I wonder, in terms of that voice that Joyce would have had and the voice that you have in your writings, have you ever felt that in order to talk about topics that are important to you or to express them in a particular way, runs afoul of not doing philosophy the right way, or sort of going at odds to what's your tutors and peers, how they would go about things?
Absolutely, I have had that experience, the experience of being advised to not talk about certain things or not talk about certain things in a certain way, making my mentors uncomfortable with certain choices I wanted to make. I mentioned in my lecture that I thought Joyce's PhD topic was somewhat misguided. I think my own PhD topic was misguided because I was trying so hard to please my mentors. And so instead of writing about what was in my heart, I wrote about what I thought was acceptable to my advisor, who was a utilitarian philosopher called Richard Brandt. And he gave me a reading list and said, read these books and these articles and talk about this. So I do feel that there's a pressure to please our mentors, and which for people of color and women, sometimes that means we're not dealing directly with the issues of concern to us. And that could be advanced by more philosophical analysis. So the great thing about today is that we do have on our faculties increasingly women and people of color who are there and available as role models and mentors to students who may want to write topics that are a little bit outside of the mainstream. Briefly, in final response to your question, I do sometimes think that people like Joyce Mitchell Cook or like me feel as though we have to choose an exceptionally difficult, nerdy, uncontroversial topic in order to be accepted. And that is disappearing. I think what I'm seeing from younger philosophers are topics that directly go to, what is happening in the world right now, history, the sociology. They're going to the conditions of life and addressing those, not necessarily in quite as the radical extreme way of an Angela Davis, but certainly not in the let's hold back and try to impress our white male mentors way of a Joyce Mitchell Cook or myself writing, starting to write 30, 40 years ago.
Excellent, thank you. I think, Buki, you had a question. It might be interesting in this having had that discussion to now to hear your question. Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you, Professor Allen, for both a personal and academic views of Joyce Mitchell Cook. I really enjoyed your lecture. On the one hand, Professor Allen notes that Dr. Mitchell Cook isn't a critical race theorist. On the other hand, you note that Dr. Cook, you categorize her as an analytic philosopher of race. And I was just wondering how Mitchell Cook might feel about such a categorization, given that she didn't often write on race in particular. And I ask, as someone whose research involves analytic methods, my focus rarely comprises particular instances or events, but rather I look at the structures and systems which underlie but are not limited to those instances and events. For example, I might look at the mode of acquirement of biases simpliciter in cognition rather than race per se. It seems to me that is why her analytical ethical system has such force and flexibility when applied to racism, as well as other areas of injustices like public philosophy and bioethics.
Yes, I think that I think she would be okay, be comfortable being described as an analytic philosopher of race to the extent that she wrote about race. And as you point out, I mean, the volume of her writing, published writing about race is quite small, but what she does write about race and what she said about race in her Wingspread interview and also with her interview with George Yancey, I think demonstrates a passion for understanding what she called the Black experience. And her unfinished life project was to write a book about the Black experience. And that book, I'm sure, would have been a book which was not only perhaps a little bit autobiographical, but it also would have used the analytic methods of Oxford-style philosophy to write about her subjects. I'm convinced of that. I don't think she would have moved into the critical race discourse type framework to do her work, both because it didn't really exist in full form until the early 1980s, but also because it just wasn't who she was, right? And thinking about your question in connection with also with Lawrence's question and my own trajectory, one of the things I did was I call it self-marginalization, where you want to be successful in philosophy, but you don't want to jump in there with the big boys. You want to do something that won't interfere with them and they'll leave you alone. So I actually chose the topic of privacy in the 1980s to write about because nobody else was writing about it. I actually wrote the first American philosophical book about privacy ever. I wrote it because at the time it was a marginal subject. But guess what? It's become like one of the greatest topics of our time. And so my work is now of vast interest and importance, and it's gained me global notoriety. But ironically, it began because I was self-marginalizing. I think that Joyce Mitchell Cook did a little bit of self-marginalization, but she was also a perfectionist, and she kind of got trapped in that. But I do think that she would not at all disagree with the categorization of herself as an analytic philosopher. And she would, I think, say, I'm trying to be an analytic philosopher of the Black experience. I think she would own that, definitely own that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. We'll have one more student question, and then I'm going to open it up to, I've got lots of other questions from the audience. Ombline, I think you said you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you so much, Professor Allen, for this really inspiring talk. I think one thing that sort of struck me from what you were saying was that you were constructing Angela Davis as being a sort of polar opposite to Joyce Mitchell Cook for, reasons that are very obvious. And I was sort of wondering if maybe what you would think about pushing against that contrast and saying that maybe Joyce Mitchell Cook was an activist in her own kind of way by, in some way, not being radical or extreme, but by sort of getting on with what she loved to do, which was philosophy. I think drawing from my own experience as a woman doing philosophy, and obviously I can't say anything about race, being myself a white woman, I found sometimes that I think one of my tutors told me that I should engage with feminist thought more. And I found that a little bit frustrating because I thought, well, had I been a man, I may not have been told this. And maybe I don't necessarily want to engage with this. And I'm not even sure that thinking through my positionality as a woman is something that will necessarily be helpful. So it's just sort of a broad question.
So I've had the pleasure of meeting both Angela Davis and Joyce Mitchell Cook. And what they have in common is they are both very gracious, very, very kind, very sensitive, and even soft-spoken women, really. They both had a fire and a passion, right? So they were alike in that respect. I think that Joyce, having been brought up in a small town with a father who was a minister, she developed a personal style that was she was confronting barriers, racial and gender barriers. She was confronting them, but she was confronting them through, I would say, the system, right? By excelling in all the things that white people and men are supposed to excel in. She excelled in those things too. And that was her radicalism. Whereas Angela Davis was brought up in Alabama during the Civil Rights era. Her parents were leftist radicals. They sent her to a leftist radical high school in New York. She then went to Brandeis University, which is a Jewish university in Massachusetts. And she learned there about the horrors of the Holocaust and the experience of the Jews. And it further radicalized her. And so she went to Germany and got into the whole Frankfurt School and the whole critical theory movement, and she was a Marxist. Joyce was never exposed to that kind of radicalism, and so maybe like transpose them, put Angela Davis in Joyce Mitchell Cook's family, and Joyce Mitchell Cook in Angela Davis's family. Guess who would have been Angela Davis? Joyce Mitchell Cook, and vice versa. But that didn't happen. So I agree with you that and I was reluctant to describe them as polar opposites, but I did it because I think a lot of people just hearing the name Joyce Mitchell Cook, first Black woman philosopher, will assume that she was a firebrand and a radical of some sort. And that wasn't her at all. And that's what I wanted to make clear in my lecture, that we're not talking about somebody who stood on a soapbox and preached. That wasn't her style at all. She was a quiet, through the system kind of radical and path breaker and trailblazer.
Thanks so much. I think it's so interesting to celebrate someone who is yeah, who is quite a quiet figure, actually.
Yeah.
Actually, can I throw something in here, Anita? I read somewhere that Joyce actually used the phrase not being politicized was her protective shield. And that she wondered whether she'd have, carried on at the beginning if she thought of herself as in some way not up to it because of race or whatever, because that would have been the thing that would have hit her. And she had this protective shield. She didn't think about it until later. I just wondered whether you'd come across that and what you thought of that protective shield.
I don't recall that exact quotation, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, if you are a woman growing up in the United States, whether the North or the South, in the 1950s, 1960s, it's probably safer and more comfortable not to be seen as one who's confronting, not to be confrontational, not to be out there. And the more she sort of stayed away from the hotness, the hot radicalism of her time, or even the civil rights movement itself, I think it did give her the ability to just get on with her business and succeed in her exceedingly amazing ways. But and I think a lot of people do that. A lot of people have done that. But also, I mean, despite being around and alive during radical movements of the 1960s and 50s and 70s, it doesn't mean that even if you're Black, you're necessarily aware of everything. I mean, I'm stunned at how I was a teenager in the 1960s, but I am stunned at how protected I was, not just by myself, but by my family from the horrors of racism and discrimination, that they did everything they could to keep me away from the realities of society and to get me focused on my schoolwork. Yet I remember very vividly the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, my mother standing in the kitchen at the stove, weeping, saying, "They killed Dr. King." And that is the only time I ever remember my family saying anything about Dr. King or the civil rights movement. But clearly it was a very, very important thing to them. But they sheltered. And I think that self-sheltering and being sheltered is something which families of color have done for generations to help their children succeed. If you stare in the face of lynching and rioting and extreme poverty and over-incarceration, if you stare in the face of that all the time and you make that your life's work, you bear a huge weight, and it's difficult. And I don't blame people who decide that they want to contribute and succeed in other ways, which is what Joyce did by being a fabulous teacher and a scholar.
Great. Now I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the chat, but before I read a question, I'm going to actually read a comment from Rowena Francis. She says, "I'm a Black female who studied philosophy and German at St Hilda's from 2011 to 15. I'm now a teacher of philosophy and plan to study for an MA in the philosophy of education next year. I'm inspired. Thank you." So I just thought I'd throw that in there. Thank you, Rowena, for that comment.
Thank you. May I just briefly comment that education was a part of my dissertation. I was interested in education and models of parental authority. I studied Thomas Hobbes and John Locke's theories of parental authority and education. And also I studied German for 4 years and went to Germany when I was an undergraduate to study German. So I feel a connection between myself and the commenter.
Okay, now I have a question that dovetails two. One person says, "Joyce seems to have taken a wrong turn with her choice of topic for her dissertation. How can today's students avoid this trap? What can the faculty do to support students at this point?" And I'm going to dovetail that with another question, interestingly, from our chair of philosophy, the faculty. He writes, "Do we know what led Dr. Cook to choose pepper as the subject of her PhD? Clearly there was it's unfortunate, if she had chosen something, I don't know, if she had chosen to write about, I'm trying to think who it might have been. Even if she had chosen to write about Dewey, that would have probably been more long lasting."
Yeah. So thank you for those questions. I don't know exactly why she chose pepper. I'm hoping that I can someday sit down with George Yancey, to whom Joyce bequeathed her papers, and look through her correspondence and her personal record to find out more about the details behind some of the choices that she made. Maybe Pepper was someone whom one of her advisors at Yale thought was going to be or was a leading ethicist. I mean, few people in America had written more about ethics than Pepper had. So again, I mean, it just may have seemed like he was a worthwhile subject for her dissertation, but she knew from the outset that she disagreed with him. And she also should have known that most people in the field of ethics disagreed with Pepper, yet she took him on. But I think that one of the things which may have made her take him on is that he was a complex thinker, right? And very few people would have had the patience to go through his very complex theories in order to assess them. And I know, Anita, that you have looked at her dissertation. It's a very complex work. Very technically complex work. And I think she enjoyed that kind of engagement in philosophy. She loved to show off in that way. I can understand this, I can do this. And she did it well. So what do you say to students trying to choose topics? How can they choose topics which are going to be worthy of them? The thing I emphasized in thinking about Joyce Mitchell Cook was, who did she expect her dissertation to put her in conversation with throughout her career? If you can't imagine a community of scholars that are going to be your allies and your enemies as you write, and that are going to provide a context for you to continue to write and discuss and learn and teach, then I think that's a bad topic. If it's a topic that isolates you, it's a bad topic. And I think that as mentors and dissertation advisor mentors, we should be guiding students toward choosing topics that are going to put them in active conversation with their peers and give them a community of researchers to be engaged with. Don't just choose a topic because it's hard, or don't just choose a topic because it's marginalized and nobody will bother you if you choose that topic. Choose a topic that creates the conversation between you and other people. I think that's the way to do it.
Interesting. Here's one. From Jean Marie Ryan. Have there been any efforts to collate all of the public documents that Joyce worked on or contributed to? Because it would be fascinating to see them.
So in preparation for this lecture, and thank you so much again for the invitation, I asked a research librarian at my university to help me collect every single thing they could find about Joyce Mitchell Cook, about her and written by her. And what we found was not that much. We found all of the book reviews that she wrote for the Review of Metaphysics. She wrote these little, sort of like 4-sentence quick reviews of the books that came in from the publisher. So she wrote many, many of those reviews, and we have all of those from 1959 and 1960 published. We also have the paper she wrote on informed consent in prisons, and we have the paper she wrote on the IQ controversy. Right. In addition to that, we have her dissertation. We were unable to find the precise speeches and communication that she worked on in the White House, or any documents that she might have worked on when she worked for the State Department. But in those kinds of jobs, typically your work is unsigned. It's not, or you're writing for an undersecretary or a secretary. And so they would get the credit for the communication or the report. So we haven't been able to find anything. But I believe that, and I hope that in her personal papers, which George Yancey and I just yesterday were talking about getting those things out into the world, that in her personal papers, I hope we can find copies of some of the reports that she knows she wrote and that she kept because she was the author of them. I would love to see her missives about Africa, for example. Mm-hmm. And I would love to see what she wrote for President Carter.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question. Interesting. What role might the network of Black women philosophers play in supporting members to gain better access to tenured positions and recognition?
We have been working so hard. Thank you, Catherine Sophia Bell, formerly Catherine Gines, for your work in starting the Black Women's Collegium. It's been a wonderful support group. We've all been supporting one another. So the group meets annually, and we read our papers to one another. We critique papers. Between meetings, we're available for mentoring and support. And that has been, I think, helpful. And I think that there's been that trend, that early trend of Black women not getting tenure, it's no longer the story. I think most of us who go into the academy and who work hard do in fact get tenure at our university. And not only do we get tenure, but we end up getting promoted to associate professor, promoted to full professor, and sometimes even going beyond to become academic administrators and leaders. So I think philosophy is working better for Black women today than it was working in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1970s was a particularly difficult and sad decade because that's when the 4 first Black women who were eligible for tenure were all denied tenure. Black university, white university, didn't matter, all denied. And if you look at their work, there was just no reason for those denials. I mean, even the fact that Joyce's paper productivity was low is not a reason for her to have been denied tenure at Howard, because in those days, if you were teaching in a department that was largely a teaching department, publication was not required. I mean, a lot of publications weren't required. So there's really no reason, I think, why someone of her accomplishment should not have been promoted and tenured at the time. So it's a disappointment that I think is a cautionary note. But again, things have gotten much, much better. And this collegium that we have is in fact the venue for Black women to find peer support for not only the content of the work, but also for the career paths that they follow. We have sessions in our meetings that are about our papers, but also sessions that are advice about the perils of seeking tenure, the perils of becoming a full professor, and so forth. Perils and benefits.
Actually, in this connection, there's a question from Umbleen. Umbleen, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I was just wondering, it actually ties very nicely to what you were saying before, that obviously today being an accomplished academic means publishing a lot, and that was not what Joyce did. I was wondering if you know anything about Joyce Mitchell Cook's teaching style, how she was with her students, what kind of relationships she had with them, and how she liked to teach philosophy.
That's a great question, and I think that the very generous donor for the Joyce Mitchell Cook Memorial Lecture has some comments about Joyce's teaching style in her video, which I recommended everybody take a look at that video. Because she actually visited Joyce Mitchell Cook's class once and saw the teaching style. I never had the pleasure of seeing Joyce either be on a panel or teach. So I don't have any personal information about that. I'm guessing from her interview style, because I have listened to 2 interviews that she gave that were recorded, that she was a clear, careful, meticulous, systematic teacher, and warm would be my guess. But I don't have any direct information about her mentor style, her teaching style. I would love to find students who are still around today who were taught by her in the 1970s and 80s. We should send out a call for people who were her former students to let us know what it was like to be in her classroom. Thank you for that question. That's something I'm going to pursue.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea, actually, because it seems like she's not left much behind that we can read or engage with in a sort of archival way, but maybe engaging with people who were taught by her that sounds like a great idea.
When you listen to her speak, she has this extremely intellectual, dispassionate, calm, but direct speaking style that was a little bit arresting, because she looked a little bit like a grandmother when I met her, and I mean, I'm stereotyping people, but but what comes out of her mouth sounds so amazingly like she should be the prime minister. That sort of way, right? That was her, presentation style, or orally in events. Yeah, but I'm sure she was a great teacher.
Okay, I have a question for the students. It's from Maddie Perham, and the question is, how did your other subjects affect your philosophy study? Because you all did sort of joint work, and to anybody listening from abroad, in Oxford you can only do philosophy with another subject, so it's an interesting question, I think. Do you think the 3 of you might say something very briefly? So let's start with Lawrence.
Yes, with computer science specifically, it's a bit different because it had only recently been introduced, and so there wasn't there wasn't as much direction with how much the computer science should affect the philosophy part. Like if you study physics, there are specific physics related modules for philosophy in there. But for computer science, there was an introductory course, really good one done by Professor Millikan in the first year. But then beyond that, it's kind of up to you. You can choose to do maths, you can choose to do philosophy of mind. So I didn't find that it impacted it too much. You could basically do as much philosophy as you chose to. So I kind of went in a lot of different directions personally. So I had philosophy of mind, ethics, philosophy of maths, and logic is probably the most closely related one to the existing computer science philosophy modules there.
And you found, obviously, the move to get a job, was that relatively easy with that degree?
Yes, I'd say that. In fact, I'd say generally for students who do hard sciences, getting into software engineering is generally considered easy because they kind of look, you're kind of curated from that list of universities and subjects. So they're generally looking there. But I do think philosophy does also kind of temper the way that you're looked at, because you don't just do problem sheets, you also understand how to, you know, do essays and a specific kind of analytic thought. So it is advantageous to have philosophy with that.
Ombline, can I ask you next?
Yes, so I did philosophy and German. So that involved doing a lot of literature actually on the German side of things. And I think this is a really great question. I think one thing that I noticed, and that my tutors certainly noticed, is I was often told that my philosophy essays were too literary and that my literature essays were too philosophical. So it's just interesting to see how both subjects sort of intertwined in the way that I wrote and thought. And I think it's been extremely enriching to be doing philosophy for the study of literature, because it's sort of, I'm told now that I maybe have a bit more experienced in writing, that I'm a very sort of systematic thinker, and that there's an attention in philosophy to defining very precisely the words that you're using. And Dr. Avramides actually has been a huge help in this process of essay writing and thinking about what words we're using and why we're using them. That's been extremely helpful in the study of literature. And I'm actually maybe hoping to go into a D field that might have to do with linking philosophy and literature. So it's still very much an ongoing dialogue for me.
Thank you, Ombline. Buki, I'm particularly interested in what you have to say, because you have this rather interesting trajectory starting with microbiology. And I believe that Joyce Mitchell Cook herself went to university, Anita, to study chemistry originally. So she also started as scientist and then moved into philosophy. And Buki, you had a similar trajectory. So could you tell us your answer to the question?
I think, unlike Joyce, as a science student, I found philosophers perplexing at the first meeting, and I wondered why they all just seemed to sit around and talk, whilst our scientists did things in the lab and put things in boxes, and it was physical. But then I realized that those phenomena that I was examining, if I truly wanted to go behind the behind, as it were, I needed philosophy. And then later on I went to look at examine what human personhood consisted in. And again, I realized that I just couldn't do it without philosophy. Luckily, by that time, I'd completely fallen in love with philosophy. And now, for a long time, I resisted. I couldn't imagine the idea of doing science and religion. And then with the help of philosophy, I can bridge the apparent gap between those two fields. And I think I can bridge it quite nicely. I am wondering, though, if I'm perhaps using that dispassionate tone that Professor Allen mentioned, that Joyce used.
May I respond? Because I find this very lovely. Because I myself am a combiner. So I've combined philosophy with law. You know, you mentioned in your introduction that after I went to get my PhD in philosophy, I went then to get a law degree from Harvard. And it's the combination of being in law and philosophy that I think explains my own level of success. I think had I merely been in philosophy, it would have not given me the breadth of expertise I would have needed to have a career both inside and outside the academy. So I'm a real lawyer. I actually sometimes do real law, do expert witness work, or represent real people in conflicts. I have that, but I'm also interested in the philosophy of law and in the legal institutions that so affect our everyday life. And I can come at law with the wisdom of philosophy. And I think that's the beauty. I love the fact that we have these comparative literature, science, computer science backgrounds. And I just love that. Throughout my life, I've always tried to relate philosophy to other things. So, Bleen, I have a paper called The Jurisprudence of Jane Eyre, which I urge you to read. And I have a paper about The Merchant of Venice, which I also urge you to read. But those papers reflect my interest in law and literature and philosophy, all rolled up into one. I would especially love your thoughts about the jurisprudence of Jane Eyre. And then on Lawrence, as you were talking, I'm thinking, I'm so interested in algorithmic fairness and in the philosophy of digital life and the philosophy of privacy. And were you today coming into graduate school, say in my university, I'd say, yes, work on these topics, and combine that with your interest in computer science. And then this whole interest in neuroscience. I mean, I mentioned I was on the President Obama's Bioethics Commission. We talked about neuroscience and ethics and the implications of developments in neuroscience as well as in genetics for values in America. And so I was on that commission. I connect with you talking about what you're interested in, because I do see that philosophy does. It takes us to literature. It takes us to science. It takes us to computer science and digital life. It takes us everywhere. And we're better at whatever we do because we have the discipline that philosophy gives us, I believe.
Well, you know what? I think that is a really good place to stop tonight, because we've all had a say. It's brought us back to philosophy, which is what we all have in common. And I'm going to say that anybody who wants to hear again, because so many interesting things were said, you might want to listen again. You can listen to this again by clicking on the link that you were sent for tonight. I'm going to draw things to a close by reading out something else that Joyce Mitchell Cook wrote. And again, I'm indebted to George Yancey for drawing my attention to this. And it's this: the 60s have raised the consciousness of us all. I cannot envisage future goals oblivious of the salient aspects of my being, i.e., Black and female. Quite reluctantly, I have acknowledged my responsibility to the social order in national conferences at which I read papers relating philosophy and the Black experience. I say reluctantly because my own interests, philosophically speaking, indicate other topics. On the other hand, I cannot carry placards, nor can I be a politician. Reasoned discourse is my medium. On that note, I'm going to thank Professor Allen for the most wonderful talk. It just brought Joyce alive for us tonight. And thank you for helping us to celebrate the life and career of Joyce Mitchell Cook. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Bleen. Thank you, Buki, for adding to our conversation this evening. Thank you all. I'm also going to thank Harrison Ferguson for technical backup, without which we could not have had this event, and to Bronwyn Travers and her team in the Development Office for all their hard work in making this event happen. And finally, may I once more, on behalf of St Hilda's, thank Joyce's friend, Eleanor Schaffer, without whom this lecture series would not have been possible. In the spring of 2022, we will hold our on-site launch of this Joyce Mitchell Cook lecture series. And at that time, we welcome you all to join us on the grounds of St Hilda's, when we'll be able together to raise a glass to St Hilda's, to philosophy, to Eleanor, and to Joyce. Tonight, I'm going to raise a glass to Joyce Mitchell Cook in the hopes that she'll continue to inspire generations of new philosophy students. To Joyce, good night, and thank you very much for joining us.